In a way, the book I have written, which is going to appear in about a month's time, is a history from below. On the one hand, it is not about people who have a lot of money, or who have a lot of power, or who have a big say in the way things are conducted, so that makes it history from below. But I think more important is the question I ask, which is, to people, to ordinary people, like artisans and craftsmen and tradesmen, who are not very wealthy, who do not belong to political parties because they didn't exist, but do they have any role in the development of historical processes? This is the question, one of the questions that I ask in the book. Do ordinary people who are far from the political scene and who do not count much for the rulers and for those who are in power, do they make history? Can they make history? So in that sense, I was interested in exploring this issue of history from below, the history of those whose history has not been written, who are often not included in history books because they are not mentioned by contemporary historians. The historians of the 18th century, the 17th century, didn't mention much about craftsmen and artisans and traders. They focused much more on people who were visible or who were notable or who had money, or whose decisions mattered. So it was, in a sense, an exploration of those whose voice were not often heard. I put this in context with something that we have just been hearing about a lot. The period I cover, 1600 to 1800, is a period of intensive trade. The conquests we've just heard about, the expansions towards the east and towards the west, America, India, Southeast Asia, and so on, created much more intensive trade than had existed before. Maritime routes became regular between places that had not been connected regularly prior to this period. So we are in a period of great trade and of intensive trade, and a period in which money circulated a lot with the gold and silver that came from America. So there's an enormous circulation. And the question I asked was this. Of course, the people who profit from trade are who? They're merchants. Merchants are the ones who buy the merchandise, they carry it from a place to another, and they make a profit. So that's very clear. Merchants profit from intensive trade. But the question I wanted to really find out was, what about the others? Do artisans benefit? Are they at all affected by this enormous movement of intensive trade of this period? And of course, the answer I found was yes, they are. But of course, not all of them. Quite a few artisans were affected, and in my view, not only were affected in a passive way, but they also contributed to the general process that was taking place in relation to trade. So we can I think we can say that artisans were part of this very great transformation taking place, which led ultimately to new circuits in the 19th century and all the developments that we place in the context of modern trade and modern economies. So that was one of the aspects.
Sorry.
The third dimension I was interested in was this.
Sorry, I was trying to turn this off, and then I turned everything off.
But I think it
Sorry. I had good intentions, but it didn't work out. Somehow this one started to speak.
Is that better? Can you hear me?
As you can see, the history of science, the history of technology, we are still not up to that level. As a professor, I don't get
the centralization of that unit controls everything. No argument wrong here. Mr. Bill Gates has something to do with
There's an Arab conspiracy theory.
We'll put it up again here. We'll be back in a second. Oh, this one's on. Can you hear this?
No.
I don't have much of a phone.
That's whose business.
If you want, you tell me in audio.
Must have it.
Almost there. Okay, how's that? Can you try now?
Can you try?
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. One of the questions I can't remember the second or the third was this. Given the fact that we always think that artisans are very traditional people, they work in guilds, they follow traditional patterns, they don't like to innovate, they tend to be autonomous, each one works alone, they're not really very greedy about making money, they're just satisfied with what they do and they don't like change very much. Now, given this situation, given what we think of artisans, one of the questions I was interested in finding out was this: could they contribute to modernity? Is there anything in the work or in the style of the way they functioned in their work? Was there anything in that which we can say was a source for developments in the 19th century, which is linked to modernity? So these were the sets of questions that I was looking at. As I looked through the court records, which were my main source, we have very, very rich records on the day-to-day dealings in front of the judges in that period. So I looked very carefully through the day-to-day dealings of their lives, and ultimately here is what I found. I found that among some artisans, especially those artisans who were working in goods in high demand in international trade, there were definitely very important changes taking place in the way that they organized themselves and in the way that they worked. And of course, among these were the textile workers. Textile was in very high demand. There's a very old tradition of textiles in Egypt, and in that period in particular, textiles were exported to Africa, to Black Africa, to the holy cities, the Hijaz, to the center of the Ottoman Empire, to Europe, and some Egyptian cloth even came to America via French merchants. So there is a very, very high demand. Okay, if there is a very high demand, if there is an increase in demand, and we are in a situation where you do not have machines, where we do not see technological advances, maybe they existed but we don't know about them. It looks like the traditional way of doing things on a loom remained the same. Therefore, how could they cope? How could they cope with the demand? Textiles apparently, and based on the work of André Raymond, was about 20% of all Egyptian export. So that's quite a lot in the 18th century. How could they cope with this demand? How could they increase their input with no technological advances? That was the issue. Well, what I found out is that they did so by reorganization of the work. For example, instead of working each one in his workshop, producing what a single person or a single person with his assistant or maybe with 2 assistants, would do. What they sometimes did was to reorganize themselves in bigger workshops, in which we presume, although the details are not always very clear, we presume that there is a kind of division of labor. Sometimes it is family working together, and sometimes it is members of a guild who get together and do their work in one single place. So that implies a kind of organization. It implies better efficiency, and it implies, although we don't have figures, but it implies the ability of a greater output. Now, why was this important? This was important, I mean, this particular example, which I found among the workers of printers on textile, they decorate. So I presume they were just sitting there with an enormous piece of cloth, and each one would have, I don't know, maybe a few meters, maybe they divided it in a different way, and then they could produce, because these printed cloths were very, very fashionable in the 18th century. They were very much in demand. There's a lot of competition on who would make these printed cottons, and they could be sold very, very easily. So the output must have been very big. Why this particular example was very interesting was for a number of reasons, one of which I just said. It implies a bit of output simply by reorganizing yourself with no extra technological advances. I find it also very interesting because in the 19th century, factories were created by Muhammad Ali. Real factories, I mean machinery, management, etc. Well, they tended to use the same kind of technique. Families working together, guild members working together. They had already that system in place, and they could organize the labor in a more efficient way. So that was very significant because it tells us a whole lot of things. That an industry depends on machines, but it can also be making use of a kind of labor organization which had a higher efficiency. So there is a kind of continuity between the traditional craft and the industrial craft. And I thought that was important because we always have this dividing line between the traditional economy and the industrial economy. But in reality, there are quite a few continuities that one can see along these lines. Well, I thought that was one of the most significant examples, but of course there were many others in the way that, for example, artisans got together, they pooled their efforts, they put money, in other words, they're using capitalist practices. It's not a capitalist economy, but they use capitalist practices in order to cope with new demands on the international market. So, in terms of raw material, you want to get together, they know you don't have enough money, you get 2, you get 3, you get 4 people, they pool their modest capitals, and then they can buy raw materials and produce more. And so there were many little techniques that they sort of invented. I mean, these are not big capitalists, there are no banks lending them money, and yet we find slow sort of not only inventive ways of going around things, but we also find sort of techniques that eventually were developed later into, you can say this is perhaps the seed of some sort of capitalism that was further developed in the 19th century. I mean, this is, in very few words, the main lines of the book. I do go into individual histories. This is very important, I think, because when you talk about international trade, it's a global phenomena. It touches very large territories. For me, it was important to see this from the point of view of individuals, families who experienced it, and to see the experience of this important phenomenon from the angle of people's lives. How did they see it? How did they experience it? What are the problems that they met? What are the threats? What are the menaces that they had to go around in order to become part of this new trend? So that's also part of the idea of history from below. Thank you very much.